I mentioned my frustration with how the administration has approached Syria and ISIS. And the fact is that we had the State Department here, officials in front of this committee 2 years ago, sounding the ISIS alarm, explaining that action had to be taken. The Iraqis and our own officials pushed for airstrikes early on, and pushed for those airstrikes when ISIS was most vulnerable in Raqqa, in Syria. But the White House sat paralyzed. Once the airstrikes did start, and that's after a year of watching cities fall from Fallujah to Mosul and the central bank being taken over by ISIS. After that, we finally saw airstrikes averaging 19 a day, but in a circumstance in which three-quarters, because of exceedingly restrictive rules of engagement, three-quarters of those planes flew back to their bases without dropping their ordnance. If we compare that and consider the first Gulf War, Desert Storm, those airstrikes averaged 1,000 combat sorties per day, not 19. And now enter the Russians. The State Department said that this wouldn't impact our air mission over Syria, and yet the numbers that the committee put together say otherwise. In October, while the Russians did 800 airstrikes for the full month, mostly aimed, by the way, at the opposition, we managed just 100 against ISIS. Assistant Secretary Patterson, are we ceding the skies to Russia here and, in effect, allowing the ISIS threat to grow? Because, after all, ISIS has gained territory here during this time frame. So say the NGOs on the ground.
Mr. Chairman, obviously I'm not for DOD, but let me try and answer this question. Actually, this question came up at a very high-level meeting, and I will quote to you what a senior military officer said, which is, "We don't hit targets we can't see." And this was in reference to the very bad weather that had overtaken the area last week when the strikes were limited, and that we can't be compared to the Russians in any moral or operation or tactical sense. The battlefield, I might suggest, Mr. Chairman, is very different in a very complex battlefield mixed in with civilians. There are very high standards vis-a-vis collateral damage and civilian casualties that I would suggest the Russian Air Force is not subject to, and that we are appropriately subject to, which is different, very different than the first Gulf War and the mass of conventional forces. So that, I think, is at least a partial answer, Mr. Chairman, to your question.
Well, from the way I perceive it here, especially given my frustration with the first year of this conflict and not utilizing any air power when it could be very effective, we have a situation today where we're hitting the bad guys in this, ISIS, 100 times, and the Russians are hitting those that are opposed to ISIS and Assad 800 times. That's my takeaway in a broad sense of where we are now. But Ambassador Nuland, this isn't just Russia reaching out to save an old ally. When we look at those remarks, we're seeing Russia and Iran work together in ways most had not expected. I certainly don't think the administration expected it. I don't think they expected we'd find Hezbollah fighters, and Iranian Quds forces and Russian headquarters, working together in this kind of a circumstance. But this was General Soleimani traveling to Moscow in the middle of our nuclear negotiations and putting this plan in place. Twice, as I understand it, he made that travel in violation, by the way, of the embargo. Again, something that wasn't objected to when I raised the issue that the head of the Quds forces, who, by the way, was responsible himself indirectly for the death of some 600 Americans, I'm told by the Pentagon, that he was in Moscow making arrangements with the Russians There was no protest that I am aware of this being a violation of the travel ban. And of late, Russian aircraft have been seen running Iranian weapons into Syria. Again, that's a very clear violation of the embargo, which we all support. So what steps are being taken to uphold the UN arms embargo on Iran in the face of the Russian violations?
Mr. Chairman, I'm unaware of those reports, but let me, about the movement of Iranian arms into Syria on Russian aircraft, but we will certainly get you a report
Thank you.
as soon as possible.